While this is a sociology class, it's important for us to at least have a brief discussion about basic psychological explanations of deviant behavior and violent behavior and how they relate to us in the world of sports. I will spare you the singing, but this is a popular little jingle that came from the late 1800s, and it really kind of sums up the idea of violence associated with the early game of college football. And that jingle was very representative and kind of important for us. And basically what it does is it shows how we have consumed and associate violence with the idea of athletics. And that's important because now what we're talking about is violence is if it's encoded and part of the day-to-day commerce of sports, then it may not be seen necessarily as deviant. So again, that's why we like to focus on this idea of deviant behavior, because it's going to be very, very flexible. A basic psychological explanation of sport deviant behavior, or just any type of deviant behavior, is as follows. Basic causes for deviant are going to lie within the individual's patterns and early childhood development. What happens when they were a child and how that influences them will carry on and manifest itself within adulthood. Now, while the social world can be a part of and is associated with understanding morality or deviant behavior, the problem is internal, and the focus of changing the behavior is really left up to the individual person. And so one of the phrases that you'll hear a lot from the psychological point of view or explanation is a focus on psychological abnormalities and how that can be associated with the social environment, a physical environment, and or, to some extent, biology. Here's a graphic representation essentially of the previous slide. It's just that we're looking at a lot of different things that are going to influence deviant behavior. Maybe you're looking at the social environment where a child grows up. Maybe you're looking at certain biological predispositions. These things are going to impact these psychological abnormalities that we talked about, such as the development of certain personality traits or quirks. We'll talk about Freud and the whole idea of some subconscious conflicts. All of these things manifest themselves into understanding deviant behavior. Later psychological research really showed the importance of higher and lower forms of intelligence. Specifically low intelligence, the idea and how it's associated with understanding deviant or violent behavior, is that low intelligence causes someone to not necessarily know that their behavior is wrong. It's often associated with a decreased ability to control these base or emotional desires within the individual. Now, many decades later, we now know that intelligence research is much more complicated, it's much more nuanced, and it really indicates that there's an indirect relationship between levels of intelligence and deviant behavior. But even though this idea of intelligence really became the focus in the early 1900s, we know that it's stuck around. Some of these, it's kind of been built into the social fabric of discussing deviant or violent behavior even as we think about it from the world of sports. For example, in the NFL, potential players, as they're going to be entered into the draft and at the combine, they take what's called the Wonderlic test, which is 50 multiple choice questions, and they have about 10 to 12 minutes to answer as many as they can and answer as many as they can correctly. The idea is that this particular test is going to give an indication of problem solving and the way that the individual is able to personally learn and then regurgitate very quickly, process information very quickly. This is important because many NFL franchises see this idea of a modicum of intelligence as important to not engaging in football-specific deviant behavior. Deviant behavior in this particular case may mean something as simple as a player doing their job and understanding what they're supposed to do. But a lot of people have also associated the idea of intelligence with aggressive personalities. And sometimes, in many cases, having soon to be or eventually professional athletes that have aggressive personalities, while on one hand it's very good, maybe, in a very physical game like professional football, on the other hand, it could create quote unquote off the field problems, of which we've seen many in the NFL recently. Some other smaller theories that are specifically associated with sports and this whole idea of kind of a psychological explanation for behavior are instinct aggression theory and frustration aggression theory. And they're very, very, very similar. But instinct aggression theory goes as this. Aggressive behavior is based on, and part and parcel to, human instincts. Normally we cannot control these instincts, and aggressive impulses have to be released. They have to be purged. And so the idea of sport participation is one way to channel this aggression into a positive and less harmful way. From the frustration aggression theory, it says basically that when you become upset or frustrated, we become aggressive. And if you're able to purge this aggression, the pent-up frustration decreases, and that becomes a very positive and cathartic process. It reduces future levels of aggression, and sport can be associated with this. If you've ever, or even physical activity, if you have an argument with someone at work and you become very frustrated, oftentimes one of the things that people ask you to do is to control your breathing, right? So take a few deep breaths, and what that does is it's a psychosomatic response in terms of you're trying to squelch or quell the emotional frustration by getting control over the physical aspect of your body, such as breathing. Another thing that people do, especially in corporate America that I've seen, is that they have people go and take walks. Even if you're on, say, the 33rd floor of a very large office building, they tell you to take the stairs to another floor and walk around and then take the stairs back. And again, the idea is that physical activity is helping you reduce and eventually purge that frustration that was building up. Many of you are probably familiar with Sigmund Freud and his psychological explanations and understanding of deviant behavior, just understanding of the subconscious. And one of the things that he said is that by trying to focus on the subconscious, one way of doing that is through different personality components. And you might be familiar with the id, the ego, and the superego. And the idea is that the id is the impulsive part of the person. And these could be positive things, like showing lots of passion or emotion. But it can also be negative things, in terms of maybe having fits of rage and just falling back on those instincts and being very, very emotional. The ego is the mechanism that attempts to control, to some extent, and kind of help move back and forth between what society wants and what the individual wants. The superego also, as well, is sort of the embodiment of what society says you're supposed to do. And so when you have this sort of spectrum with the id, the superego, and then the ego trying to find that common ground that really satisfies the social aspect of normative ways of behaving that the superego is saying, and then you have the individual, very, very instinctual, passionate aspect of the id. The ego is there trying to decrease this internal and emotional conflict. According to this kind of psychoanalysis point of view, is that the conflict, the building up of emotional stress, that's what influences deviant behavior. And so what you want to do is you want to try to decrease the emotional stress. And for a lot of people, you can talk about looking at recent events in the NCAA, especially in regards to mental health of student athletes. In the early part of 2018, you had a high-profile suicide of a student athlete at Washington State University. And what this really does is a lot of people in the media were using a lot of the same language that's associated with what Freud was talking about in these psychological explanations. When you talk about dealing with stress and the expectations of individuals and how painful and how harmful that can be. Now, that's not purely a psychoanalytic point of view, but it does embody a lot of the same similar ideas that are useful and have been pulled from this potential psychological explanation of deviant behavior. Generally speaking, as we start moving into other aspects and discussion points of a psychological explanation of sport deviance and violence, the idea of personality becomes very important. And we know that underlying conflict is contained within the individual's sort of mindset or their psychological framework. A lot of this has been influenced by our personality, which is developed early in our life. What's developed early in our life and an outgrowth of that personality is how we understand and how we eventually are involved in certain behaviors. Certain negative behaviors or deviance is the result of these personality traits interacting with something else. And that sort of is the focus here. The focus is looking at and trying to understand the individual and how they are going to be associated with deviant, violent, or criminal activity. While it's very important to recognize the role of the individual or these internal factors as it relates to understanding causation for sport deviance and violence, it does limit us to some extent. What they're saying is that there's a specific trait. And this trait, this idea of a trait, is very important to us in modern American society because we oftentimes talk about that as there are certain traits that influence why someone is participating in sports. Well, that same argument can be used to look at and understand why people engage in deviant behavior. And that's a very, very limiting, it's a very narrow road to go down when trying to discuss the very unique and the very complicated topic of sports deviance. So the major limitations is that it does not necessarily explain or even differentiate between on-field and off-field behavior, when what we do know is that they are different. For many athletes for many decades have talked about the difference between what they do on the field and how they interact with other people off the field. Also, what's going to be very important for us is trying to look at and understand the social environment. Society is important and it has a very distinct and powerful impact on individuals. So having just a psychological or an individual explanation for deviant behavior does limit us most of the time. I'm not saying that these theories are not useful, because they are. And oftentimes, especially in American culture, which tends to be a little bit more individualistic, these theories can be very appealing. And like I said, they're very useful when talking about certain cases. But if we want to talk about the idea of the prevalence of deviant behavior and how it's associated with sport, or what is considered deviant within sport as compared to outside of sport, or how violence is part of our sporting American culture, then we need to rely on some other social or environmental factors.